Crime, Chris Matz has done wonders to revitalize this building as the Learning Commons for the community. My name is Aliki Silva. I coordinate the college's Hawaiian student programs. So what that means is we serve Hawaiian students in all fields of study, as well as all people who cherish Hawaii. So we are so grateful that you are here today. Our Distinguished Cultural Speaker Series event, we average about 2 per semester. They are open events to the community. Some faculty award extra credit for these presentations, but what we realized is that the journeys our students are on require inspiration. For you to finish, for you to come out of college and to become an active Lahui builder, we need to bring accomplished Native Hawaiians in all fields to inspire you, to keep you going. So please help me in welcoming Dr. Kalani Brady, who didn't want me to say much about him, except that he's a very, very dedicated servant of the Kalaupapa community, has been so for 10 years, and is teaching Hawaiians and Pacific Islanders to become doctors and to build our Lahui through health. So please help me welcome Dr. Kalani Brady.
E mai, na lehua, no papa wa kia iha nau ia lau kapalilila, o la ika mano o mauna ala e kapo kamakapulaka kia me laka uli e kau oli akai ma lama nei, na ia pau pele I pau ni huku muhea mai kailua ka vai hawa pilipu me ka lua hine vai, ka vai hai o ka malanai painui ua nui ki pupu o kukai le moku me kukai le moe moi ka maupulu I ke kue hulapo I kua no I au moe ka la I ka maoli ola ele maoli ola ka laipo haku ele o hula lai ola ia aloha 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 aloha. I'm Kalani Brady. I'm descended from the Keli'i Kanakaʻoli Aipualani family. We're primarily from West Kauai. We say West is best. Waimea ke kahasai. But I was actually raised on Oahu in Kailua, as my oli introduced, and went to school there, and then went to away for a good deal of school, and then came back, and I'm very happy to be part of the Department of Native Hawaiian Health of the John A. Burns School of Medicine. One of my precious assignments is being the kauka for Kalaupapa. When Emmett Aluli, my Hanai cousin, basically said, Kalani, we need Hawaiians to be taking care of Hawaiians in Kalaupapa, the previous doctor had been there, a true saint, for 8.5 years, but he was getting very old and he was getting somewhat sick. I said, sure, I'll look into it. And he and I had known each other from earlier days. And so Emmett took the initiative in calling him the next day. And then he called me that day. And he said, so Kalani, I hear you're interested in helping take over Kalaupapa from me. And I said, well, if, with your permission, he said, do you want to start tomorrow? So we started in the fall 10 years ago now. I was worried. Miloli'i. Little towns like Hana. You look at someone, looks poi haole, and they're not from the area, they're malihini to Kalaupapa. I was worried about being accepted. But what I hadn't counted on was that they had been watching me in their bedrooms on KHON 2 every morning as they got dressed. And so we went around, and Phil Jones would introduce me, and they'd say, oh, Kalani, we know Kalani, he's fine. And so that began a relationship that has lasted these 10 years. And I was told that I was Kalaupapa, that didn't matter that I only lived there 2 days a week. I was Kalaupapa. So when we went as a group
places. I was part of that group, weddings, memorial services, and then of course 4 years ago the canonization of Father Damien, and then last year the canonization of Mother Mary Ann. I was basically on those trips to take care of the patients. Well, a little history. I'm not a historian, so the history I give you can probably be improved by some of you in the audience. In 1778, Cook came here and found a thriving lahui of between 300,000 and 800,000 Kanaka Maoli, Native Hawaiians. They actually may have been more, I've been told recently, because Cook's sailors didn't know about the uplands, Waimea, Ulupalakua. They couldn't see those areas to count those Hawaiians. So it may have been a population approaching what Hawaii is today. Can you imagine, with all our high rises, and I live in one of them, can you imagine that this culture lived here in one story with pristine water and good hygiene for centuries? Well, what happened, you know, the sailors came. The missionaries didn't have much to do with it, although they're frequently blamed. In the 1810s and 1820s, there weren't any missionaries. There were just sailors. And our ali'i actually sailed away, and Hawaiians were really good sailors, so a lot of them ended up being on vessels that went here and there. And we brought back to our people measles, influenza, smallpox, even the plague. And so by the 1850s, there were not 800,000 of us left. There were 80,000. And the ali'i, very different from the ali'i of Western nations, where the king of Spain could be Austrian or German. It just happens to be that they were in Spain when they married somebody here. Here in Hawaii, the ali'i were the parents, in a sense, for all of us. And so they watched their nation crumble, and they wept. And it was a great period of sadness. Well, in 1850s, people came back with a new ma'i, a new disease. This disease, unfortunately, didn't take you that day or the next day or the next day. In a sense, influenza was a blessing. You got sick, 3 days later, you had passed. There was suffering for only 3 days. But this disease, called ma'ipake, the Chinese illness, or ma'iali'i, because ali'i brought it back too, was a disease that had a prolonged course, and we'll talk about that in a second. It was like the devil mauled you with its claw, and you were disfigured. Inside, you had a tender human soul. Outside, you looked like a monster. And accounts of our Hansen's patients going to Kalaupapa and looking called these people monsters. They were afraid of them. The first person that actually took me on the stage, I sing on the side. And when I was in the 60s, Danny Kaleakini took me on stage. He's been a friend all those years. And he told me, Kalani, when I first went to Kalaupapa, I was afraid. I had to master my fear. And I went back and I overcame the fear after the first time. But it was a fearsome disease. And you're never sure, am I going to catch that? Am I going to become a monster? And so because of this and the lack of knowledge about how this was spread, the kingdom's Board of Health, a bunch of Poehauli physicians, Kauka, got together and recommended to King Kamehameha V that he develop a quarantine place. And they looked at places like Kaho'olawe, but Kaho'olawe was too dry. They knew that if they took these patients who were so sick and sent them to that place, then they surely would die, and they had no chance of living out growing kalo and growing uala and having a chance to subsist. Well, they picked this place, and in 1865, I'm ahead of myself. In 1865, they determined that Kalaupapa would be the Hansen's disease settlement. And we'll talk about that in a second. But first, let's talk about Hansen's disease and its scientific side. The median age today of onset of this disease is between 20 and 30 years. Part of that is that it takes 3 to 5 years before you even get it in manifestation once you've actually gotten the disease. So when you have Hansen's disease, it takes that long to grow. Hence, no one knew exactly how it grew. There's a story about one patient who was a convicted killer that the king allowed to be used as a guinea pig, and he agreed to be a guinea pig rather than face death for his murder. And they actually took a piece of flesh from a Hansen's patient and inserted it into the man's arm, and he didn't catch leprosy. So they didn't really know how this was. It could be that they didn't wait 3 to 5 years. It's rare in children under 5 because it's a 3 to 5 year incubation. In fact, back then, it was, now it's rare to have them under 10 or 15. Back then, we'll talk about Hawaiian and what happens to a Hawaiian baby. And mother gives the baby to Auntie, and Auntie cuddles the baby. And then Tutu gives it. And Uncle gets the baby and cuddles and coos. And maybe one of them has a cough. And they cough while they're cuddling and cooing the baby. And the baby inhales. That's how you get Hansen's disease. So if you have a load of bacteria that you inhale into the lungs, that's where you get it. But only 3 to 5% of the world's population is particularly susceptible to Hansen's disease. In fact, Howleys are almost not, universally not susceptible to it. There were leprosariums in Europe, but not many Howley got it. Unfortunately, we Polynesians have a cell-mediated immune deficiency. You know the kakio that we get in Pataigo when we're kids? Cell-mediated immune deficiency. We have a higher baseline risk of tuberculosis, cellular-mediated immune deficiency. Hansen's disease is called Mycobacterium, which is the part of tuberculosis, leprae. So it's the cousin of tuberculosis. It's spread the same way as tuberculosis. And we Polynesians, Micronesians, Filipinos, Southeast Asians, Chinese, Maipake, Indians, East Africans, those are the people that are more susceptible to Hansen's disease. Okay, we talked about the most common route of entry. The reason I put no evidence of sexual transmission is not that I have sex on my mind. It's that the Calvinists back then, and we'll get to that part of history in a second, actually proposed that the way that Father Damien got leprosy was that he was having relations with his female leprosy patients, and that's how he got it, which is not true at all. He had intimate contact, non-sexual, with all of his patients because he held them as they died. He bandaged their wounds, which are very common in Hansen's disease, and they coughed and spluttered up into his face. The stench, the hauna of this set of wounds was so bad that Damien started smoking a pipe in order to be able to stand taking care of his patients so that he wasn't repulsed by the poison that the patients had. Clinical features, as I said, the devil scratching your features. It has particular affinity for the skin, cooler areas of the body. So Hansen's patients, they lose their earlobes, they lose their eyebrows, they lose their nose. You can see the pictures over there. Those pictures include several of my patients to this day. and several that have passed since I started taking care of them 10 years ago. Sometimes you'll have a mouth and nose that's just one gaping hole. Sometimes you'll have an autotracheotomy where the hole is really here, and this is a hole, but you breathe in and out of this hole. And for Kane, of course, the olos are affected, and if the child gets it at 5 or 6 years old, they get affected there. The Hansen's disease bacteria destroy the olo, and then the child goes through puberty and doesn't turn masculine. And so there were a lot of aikane mahu in Kalaupapa through the late part of the 19th century and the early part of the 20th century. This part is scientific, and if you want to know the basis of our classification of Hansen's, but it's not germane to this presentation. So here's King Kamehameha establishing an act to prevent the spread of leprosy. Kalaupapa was chosen. In 1866, the first boatload of a dozen patients came down to Kalaupapa and were dumped on the shore of Waikolu Valley. Kalaupapa actually is one of two ahupua'a on the peninsula called Makanalua, 2 gifts. The other one is Kalawao, and in fact, for the first 35, 40 years of the Hansen's settlement, it was in Kalawao, on the windy side, on the barren side of the peninsula. And Kalaupapa was actually a fishing village as it had been for hundreds of years. So sometimes they were able to beach at Kalaupapa and the patients would walk across. More commonly, they would be taken in by longboat from ships into Waikolu Valley. Between 1866 and 1873, almost 1,000 patients came to Kalaupapa. And in the history of Kalaupapa, there have been 8,000 people who have lived and died there. This is a picture of the Pali. I was talking earlier with somebody who has hiked down the Pali, and this is the little trail. And this trail has 26 switchbacks. You can see some of them here. It's a formidable way to get up and down. In fact, you can't climb this Pali unless you're on the trail. And even the trail is a succession of either steep grade or cinder block stairs. It's really very hard to get up and out. And at the top of this Pali is a gate, and at the gate is a guard. And with the guard is his gun. So if you escape from Kalaupapa, the guard sees you and says, "Nice hike. Now turn around and go home." This is the picture of the Pali from the foot of the trail right here. Amazing cliffs. These are the tallest sea cliffs in the world, according to the Guinness Book of World Records. This is the barren side, Kalawao side. Not very hospitable. Not a lot of trees now. Not a lot of trees then. This is Waikolu Valley, the Valley of 3 Waters, and this is the beach on which these patients were basically landed. These are looking east across the Pali cliffs of Molokai. Idyllic from afar. Here's a closer view of the beach here. These little pebbles here are boulders that are up to 3 and 4 feet in diameter. It's not a sand beach. It's not a rough pebble beach. It's heavy rock. There, you see it better. And on the way in, and this is why this will be important in a second, are these shoals. Some of them are coral shoals. Some of them are just rock. And some of them are barely beneath the surface. If you're not a waterman, you wouldn't read the fact that these have sharp shards. So if you're forced to swim in, then you open your belly on these shards and then probably end up dying a lot earlier than you would with Hansen's disease. on a ship, what is the captain's primary responsibility? The ship, the safety of the vessel and its passengers and crew. The Hansen's patients were not considered passengers. So if the ship was in danger by sending the longboats out, if the longboats were in danger in heavy seas, then the Hansen's patients that went over were dumped unceremoniously over the side to swim in or drown. Not all Hawaiians swim. This is the Protestant church built a few years before the Catholic Church. There was a deacon of the Protestant church who had Hansen's disease, and he was there by necessity, of course, but he led a congregation. There's the closer view. The lua over here does not say kane and wahine, it says patience and kokua. That's the demarcation in Kalaupapa. I'm going to tell you a story about Moke. Moke was raised in Ko'olaupoko on this island, Kailua, near Kawainui, the swamp there, the marsh. And his parents were worked lo'ikalu, and they worked hard. They started before the sun got up and frequently ended before the sun was down. But it was an honest work, and they had their hale, and Moke grew up in this hale, and it was a pili, a grass hale, and Moke decided with growing in the 1830s and 40s, more of these buildings that looked more like they were from New England and from the continent, that he was going to have one of these. He didn't want to be in a grass house. He wanted a little bit more opportunity. So when he got to be 16, Moke actually traveled over the Pali and came to Honolulu. And at 16 already he was 6'6", he weighed about 285 pounds, and he had no fat. He was a strong Hawaiian man. And he went down to the harbor, and he got a job as a longshoreman, back-breaking work. But Moke, he was so big and so strong that other longshoremen would have trouble lifting and carrying things, and for Moke it was easy. And he was generally liked and admired by his fellow workers because he did so well. Well, Moke was working one day, and you know the longshoremen, they wear long sleeve shirts because there's a lot of carrying and they don't want to get their arms all cut up. A constable came by, and the constable said, "You Moke?" He said, "Yeah." He said, I want to see your arm. And Moke towered over this constable and said, "What's the matter?" He said, I want to see your arm. I hear there's a kakio on your arm. And Moke actually thought about fixing the constable right then and there, but decided not to. So he took the sleeve of his arm up, and there was this white spot about 1 inch by 3/4 of an inch. And the constable examined it. He says, "Can you feel my finger?" And Moke said, "No." He was arrested on the spot. He was taken to Kalihi Hospital. Kalihi Hospital wasn't like Queens Medical Center. Married 2 years ago, 2 years before, and his wife had given birth to a son. So Moke actually hoped that maybe his wife and his son would come to the gate. So he used to stand out at the gate every day and wait to see if Nani, his wife, would come. She didn't come day after day. And then the nurse who was in charge of that ward told him one day that he was going to be examined by the doctors. And she gave him a shift instead of his regular clothes. And he went with her into a room and was told to stand on a pedestal. And around the pedestal were a bunch of men in long white coats. And they spoke. They never spoke to him. There was no introduction. There was no treatment of normal respect. They just talked about him like he was an animal. And after talking for a little while, they directed the nurse to tell him to drop his shift. And he was standing there naked. Now, Hawaiians were not unused to nakedness, but the fact that they were there clothed and talking about him in a demeaning manner, he really began to feel shame, hila hila. Well, one of them came up and started fondling him. First he checked the earlobes and the nose, the lips. Then he reached down and he grabbed the olos, and he was examining the olos right in front of all these other men in long white coats. And the others got up and came over and likewise examined him and talked right in front of him. Not to him, but to each other. Moke felt sick. After a while, he was told he could replace his shift, and he was taken back to the ward. The next day, he looked out. As if in shame. And Moke kept calling for him, and finally the man had to respond because it was so obvious Moke was looking at him. He said, "How's my wife, Nani? How's my baby?" And they said, shame of having a family member with leprosy and the fear, not knowing how it was transmitted, that everybody around would think, oh, that means you have leprosy as well. See over there? Some had their family bravely come to Kalaupapa as kokua, but the majority of them were abandoned by them. Such fear, such loathing. 2 days later in the evening, the nurse came again, but this time with a bunch of men, and informed Moke that he had been convicted of leprosy. And his sentence was life imprisonment in Kalaupapa. So he had been arrested, put on trial, convicted of nothing more than a disease, and sentenced to life in this place that had a reputation for horror. And under cover of dusk and then dark, they were taken down to the very harbor side where he had worked as a longshoreman. And they were put in the hold of the vessel, which hadn't been cleaned from the pigs and the cattle that came in from neighbor islands. So the kukai was in the holds. And on the rough crossing to Molokai, many people that with Moke were sentenced to life in Kalaupapa gave their puae to the kukai that was in the hold. And then slept practically not at all, but fitfully dazed. Noticed, because there was no door on the hold, noticed, look up, the sky looked a little bit light as the day started. And they were taken out of the hold and put in longboats and taken ashore. They weren't thrown over the side because it fortunately was a calm day. What Moke beheld is something that some of you may have seen in horror movies. when they have zombies. They had men and women moving slowly because of these rocks and moving carefully because of the ease with which you get sores that don't ever heal. And they were looking like monsters. And they came down to greet, honestly, the new lepers. But from the perspective of Moki and the others, it looked like a horror movie. Moki was so scared that he jumped out of the boat when there was 3 or 4 feet of water and ran to the side. And he was sick again as he realized that in 3 to 5 years, that would be him. He had been a good man his whole life. He had been upright. He never stole. He didn't even drink. He had tried to obey all the commandments that people had told him should be obeyed. And now he was sentenced to life and death in this horrible place. And his spirit broke. Would not yours? And he looked up at heaven and he said, "Damn you, God!" And he became one of them. The brigands of Kalaupapa. The next group, he took a 10-year-old boy and a 12-year-old girl and enslaved them. And he found one of the wahine, and she became his partner. And every night they drank okolehau and had sex. And the children were basically dehumanized and raped night after night after night. Can you blame him? Would that have been me or you? The reason I tell that part of the story is so that it's so easy to condemn the people that acted like brigands, that killed, that raped, that had a life that was horrific, basically, in the civilization standards. And yet, could that have been us? There but for the grace of God would go us. Well, he became one of the might ruled. Might made right. This man is Joseph de Verster. Joseph de Verster was born into a landed farm family in Tremelo, Belgium. This was a family that, not like squatters that had a landlord. This was family that actually owned their land. And that meant that they had some wealth. And they were good at farming. And of course they were Catholic, so they had lots of kids. And so the kids grew and the farms prospered. And the oldest boy was actually felt called to the ministry. His name was Pamphile. And he went to his parents and said, "I believe I've been called to become a priest." And the parents were rejoiced because it was such an honor to have someone who was called to become a priest in the family. And then later, one of the sisters came and said, "I believe I've been called to join the ministry and become a sister." But they had their hope set on Joseph, because Joseph was stocky, perhaps 5'8" or 5'9", built like a stocky farm animal, good strength. He had smarts, not in the way Pamphile did, who became a theologian in Rome later. But this guy, he could build anything. He could build farmhouses, he could build all kinds of things, and he was a great farmer. And his parents had hope in him that he would take over the farm. So it was with mixed emotions when he came to his parents and said, "Like Pamphile, I feel called to become a priest." But who's to argue with the will of God? So they went actually, they blessed him, and he went to the same seminary in Paris that Pamphile had gone to, and the seminary theologians that taught these young people to become priests, they watched
Joseph? Well, you know, Pamphile had a gift with intellectual stuff. You know people like that probably. So Pamphile could speak Flemish, German, French, and Latin. Along comes Joseph. Joseph could speak Flemish. But the Mass was celebrated with a priest looking toward the altar away from the people. He couldn't quite hear the Latin. He never really got it. So he couldn't speak Latin. And so the theologians, the professors said, you know, Joseph, we are so grateful God has called you to us. We don't think you're being called to be a priest. We think you're being called to be a choir brother. Well, I'm a member of a choir. And it's a great thing to sing. However, choir brothers get up before everybody else and peel the potatoes. They make the meals. They clean up the meals. They empty the chamber pots. You know what those are? Chamber pots when everybody has to do their business. Because they didn't have bathrooms and flush toilets back then. And they clean up every meal. So Joseph had this long day. He had the humility to say, if it's the will of God. And Pamphile was ordained and given his work assignment, Sandwich Isles. And he came down with typhus. And the professors didn't know what to do. So they actually took counsel, and Joseph, for the first time in this story, stepped forward and said, here I am. Send me. They discussed among themselves. They said, okay, we'll send you. And so in 1863, in October, he boarded a ship in Bremerhaven, Germany. 5 months later, arrived in Hawaii. Went to my high school, St. Louis, for 2 months, and was ordained a priest, and chose the name Damien, after the priest, Saint Damien. So that was what happened to Damien. The first 7 years, he was running all over Hawaii Island, in Puna, and later in Kohala, trying to baptize people before the Well, 1873, after all this time around Hawaii Island, St. Anthony's. How many of you know about St. Anthony's Maui? It's the high school that the Catholic Church has, yeah? Well, St. Anthony's Church was consecrated in 1873. By then, Moki and his bunch had led to the deserved reputation that Kalaupapa was a pit of hell, and everybody was afraid was not a strong enough word of Kalaupapa. And Bishop Mike Gray, who had ordained Damien, was at St. Anthony's and said to his priests, this, I have to ask you to do a mission for me. 4 of you. I won't ask one of you to do it because it's too horrible a task. But I want each of 4 of you to do 3 months there and round robin. And then you can come back and be with civilization. Don't get too close to the Hansen's patients. But say Mass for them. Do what you can to support them. And Damien stood and second time said, here I am, me. Well, I'm a newsman. Some of you may know that I work for KHON. We get it wrong sometimes. And they got it wrong in the newspapers in 1873 because they didn't get it that there were 4 of them that were going to round robin. They got it that Damien had volunteered and sacrificed his life, like the convicted Hansen's patients, to serve those unfortunates in Kalaupapa. And word spread like wildfire. While Kalani the Barbarian has the miracles of Damien, not the same ones that the Roman Catholics have. The first miracle of Damien was ecumenicism. That means everybody working together. And I belong to Central Union Church, which is a Protestant church in town. It was at the corner of what is now
the state capital. And history books say that a group of leaders, deacons, of the Protestant church, the prominent Protestant church in town, which was Central Union, gathered a large amount of funds and gave it to the Cathedral of Our Lady of Peace, the Catholic Church. Imagine Bishop Mike Gray getting ready to celebrate Mass, and looks down and sees this group of Calvinists, Protestants, come walking in the church and walking down to the front of the church. Can you imagine what he's thinking? What are they going to do? Are they disrupting the church? Is there going to be more trouble? And yet they gave a sizable donation in honor of Damien. Now what do you do? Well, Damien actually agreed to stay in Kalaupapa, and the other three were off the hook. And he went with just himself and his rosary and a few other things. And he went to this church, which was actually, this part of it was built by him. And he stayed under a lauhala tree, which is right there. That cross is actually where Damien was buried. And he walked into the homes of people like Moke, and he took the children. What kept Moke from killing him? Maybe the Roman collar? Who knows? But within a few months, he had all the children and a few of the women who were his congregation. Most of the men, unless they were dying, didn't have anything to do with him. He was interrupting their lifestyle. This is another perspective of that same church. This was actually the active entrance back when Damien was there. So he ministered to the sick and dying. He built lots of coffins. He buried the dead. And he also had endless energy, it seemed. So he went up topside and founded a couple more churches. Somehow he got through that guard with a gun at the top. Maybe it was his Roman collar. But one of those times in 1883, 1883, he'd been there 10 years. He came down. He was tired. You hike up that trail and down that trail and you spend your time building a church. You get tired. Your legs are tired. So he sat down. He made himself a bucket of water, warm water, in order to soak his feet. He sat down. He put his left foot into the bucket. Put his right foot into the bucket. Ah! He lifted it immediately because it was too hot. He had burned his right foot. It took him a couple of seconds to realize, as he lifted his left leg out, to see the skin hanging in shards from his leg, that he had burned his left leg and foot. How did he do that? He had Hansen's disease. God took this boy Hauli and gave him the dubious gift of Hansen's disease. So the next Sunday, he's up in front of his ragtag group of a few males, more females, and all the kids. And he said, "We lepers." Can you imagine saying "we lepers" in front of a bunch of people who have really suffered with leprosy? That's insulting, because they didn't know he had it. Nobody caught it, or a few people caught it. Most of them were looking out the window and probably didn't catch it the first time. So he said it a few minutes later. By then it was somewhat of a stir in the congregation. And he lifted his pants leg, and they saw the burns, and they realized what had happened. That in fact, he was one of us. He was a Hansen's patient, a leper. Something changed. The people of Kalaupapa said, he's got our disease. He still has his faith. He's got our disease. He's still interested in service. He has our disease. He's going to die horribly, but he's still taking care. And the men, 10 years after he arrived, began to really admire him. And they chose him not as their spiritual leader only, but as their civic leader, as their advocate. And so Damien became one of them with his second miracle was the dubious gift of leprosy. Well, let's take a trip today to this place. So you get out of Honolulu Airport on a one-engine plane, and it's pretty bumpy. I get airsick on small craft, so every week that I go, I get airsick. Fortunately, I haven't barfed yet in 10 years, but every week I feel like barfing, both getting over there and coming back. You look at Mauna Leahi, Waikiki, Kapiolani Park, beautiful Kalaupapa Clinic. And there is the dorsal fin, Kalaupapa. And Kalawao plane is circling to land, the famous Kalaupapa lighthouse. Not much trees. That's how it was then. This is the danger of landing and taking off in Kona weather, because the north swell is high enough that the waves come right over the runway. So you have to time the landing so you don't end up stalling in one of those waves. That's what the wave looks like when you're taking off. You have to wait until the wave has come over and then take off. And then this is the ride into the settlement. And I got scolded. I'm a member of the Hawaiian Civic Club of Honolulu. And I gave this talk at their request a while back, and the aunties all scolded me. They said, Kalani, Kalaupapa is about the graves. It's about the 8,000 who lived and died there. And I had been so voracious about the ones that lived there that I had forgotten to include the graves. So got the scolding, went back the next week, took all these pictures of the graves. This is a fresh grave. Everyone in Kalaupapa is buried within 24 hours. Most have no family, so this is tradition. They're not embalmed, they're just buried. This is the hospital where I see my patients. This is the Catholic Church on the Kalaupapa side, and the Protestant Church on the Kalaupapa side. The beautiful water of Kalaupapa. It's better than Hanauma Bay. What are these things here? They're the Federal Investigation Station. This is a lesson for us as Haumana to learn. In 1893, what happened? The overthrow of the sovereign Kingdom of Hawaii and the Liu o Kalani, and the replacement with sort of a puppet government that was called the Republic of Hawaii. And Dole and Thurston and others basically plotted the overthrow from the basement of Central Union Church, my church, leading to an apology 100 years later. They had trouble because Damien was a prolific writer, and he'd written asking for help for wood to build places and for food, because the ship's captains in Honolulu would be paid to take wood over, and they'd be paid to take food over. And then a lot of those ships never made it to Kalaupapa. Somehow they ended up in Papeete. or Apia or Aotearoa. And the ship's captains would sell the cargo and make a double killing because they never delivered it to Kalaupapa. So Damien was this tireless writer, and a negative outcome of that was that everybody in the country, the continent, thought that Hawaii was this bastion of leprosy. Because Damien was there and he was writing about this horrible situation of lepers, and they needed stuff. And so there was actually in the congressional record in the 1898 was when we were annexed as a territory. And 1900, there was congressional record debate on the floor of the U.S. Congress that maybe they should send all the lepers from the entire United States to Hawaii. Because after all, it was like a little Kalaupapa. It was 2,300 miles away. They didn't realize that Kalaupapa was 2 miles by 2 miles by 2 miles. They thought that everybody should go to Hawaii. It didn't happen, of course. But they had a problem with selling Hawaii. It wasn't the paradise of the Pacific. It was the bastion of leprosy. So they still didn't know how it was transmitted. And the Surgeon General of the United States in 1901 decided they were going to apply the Western scientific method. Remember, that was the era of Pasteur and Koch and Semmelweis and all of these giants of Western medical science. And they were going to use this kind of stuff and find out how leprosy was transmitted and perhaps even find out a cure. They were using chalmugra oil, the oil of a tree, and they were injecting it under the skin and it burned like fire. Well, the Hansen's disease lesions come and go. So sometimes they'd go. And they made the mistake of thinking chalmugra was effective, and it wasn't effective. But they wanted something better than chalmugra oil, so they created this. And this hospital, we were hoping that we would find these wonderful things, and made a big PR campaign and in Washington, D.C. and Hawaii, and look at the good we were doing for those poor unfortunates in Kalaupapa. Well, this place looked like half the size of Queens Medical Center. It was huge. It had crystal and china, and it had electric lights. Iolani Palace and Kalaupapa had electric lights. San Francisco didn't have electric lights, but Kalaupapa had electric lights. And then they asked for volunteers. Well, in scientific method back then, volunteers basically could live in this like kings and queens. But we Hawaiians, what is important to us? Our ohana, our friends. And then they said, for these experiments, you can have no interaction except through a glass pane with anybody else at all. And so they had volunteers, and there were 1,000 people alive at that time. You know how many volunteers they got? 7. They opened this huge facility. They closed the huge facility 4 years later. Total failure, culturally incompetent. And then the A'ama took all the wood from the Federal Investigation Station and built all the houses that house the Hansen's patients in Kalaupapa. And that's about when we moved from Kalawao over to Kalaupapa side. So science in the absence of being pono is worthless. And this lecture is geared to medical students. I take them over. About 2/3 of all the medical students graduating in the last decade have been to Kalaupapa by the time they graduate. So this is all that's left of the Federal Investigation Station. 1946, sulfone drugs were introduced. 1960s, treatment for a couple of months would halt transmission. In 1969, the state rescinded its Hansen's quarantine law. In 77, the residents were given the right to live out their lives in Kalaupapa. Having been sent to Kalaupapa 12 or 15 or 20. What other place did they have? They had none. So the majority of patients chose to continue to live in Kalaupapa. You guys are part of a program here at Leeward Community College that integrates Ike o Hawai'i and Western knowledge. This is my cousin Emetaluli, and that's Papa Henry Awai on Molokai. He was probably at that time, he's passed since, was the foremost Lapa'au practitioner and teacher in the state. And this is what we look for in the future of Native Hawaiian health and what we try to teach our doctors. So in 2003, the Board of Regents of the University of Hawai'i formed the department of which I'm a member, the Department of Native Hawaiian Health of the John A. Burns School of Medicine. This is a group of haumana who went with me to Kalaupapa, and a lot of them had not had the, had not grown up with an imu, so we taught them how to build an imu. A little bit of help from our friends. Hali'i down, and then the food on top of the hali'i, and more hali'i. They go to Damien's grave. They sit with patients and talk about firsthand experiences of people who have lived there for their whole lives. This is actually Richard Marks' wife, Gloria Marks, his widow. And you're all a part of this. Hokulea was over there last Wednesday in Kalaupapa with a Maori vessel, actually, an open ocean Maori canoe. This is Konsushi Island. It's actually Okapu Island, sacred island, but we call it Konsushi. Okay, and that's the settlement of Kalaupapa today. I hope that there was some entertainment as well as some education in this. The stories that I gave you are not fiction. Moke is my brother's name, and Moke does not have Hansen's. But the Moke that I described is an amalgamation of nonfiction stories of patients at the time from history books, and there are several. So these are not, I idealize what happened to Damien. Not everybody, of course, became part of this Camelot community. There was still murder, there was still rape. Some of my patients who are alive today have recounted to me being the children that arrived in the 30s and 40s and having the men talking and pointing and realizing that that's what the pointing meant. So even in the 1930s, long after Damien died in 1889, that kind of behavior unfortunately continued at times. Questions? Ninau?